Everybody. Today what we're going to do is we're going to do a comparison of the new Sony F1.8 14mm wide-angle G Master lens, which I'll be unboxing in a minute, against this Samyang 14mm F2.8 manual focus lens that I've been using for just over a year, I think. I've got a fairly old Sony A7, one of the original ones, Mark 1, and my main interest, which is why I've got these wide-angle lenses, is astrophotography. I really enjoy taking photos of the Milky Way because I just feel like it gives a really beautiful backdrop behind interesting nightscapes, and it makes for very nice photos. So we'll get started on that. Okay, so I realize that the lighting's far from perfect, but you're not here to see my dining room, you're here to see some lenses. So I have to do this now because even though it's getting late, I just got back from the post office and I cannot wait to finally try out this lens, which has just arrived, and it's the new Sony 14mm f1.8 G Master. Now this lens was announced just over a month ago, I think, and I put my order in about 2 hours after it was announced. I was hoping to get it for the lunar eclipse that happened last week, but unfortunately it didn't come in time for that, but doesn't matter. I got some good shots of that anyway. And now here it is, and I'm hoping that I can do some test shots with it tonight. So we're going to do. Okay, so here we go. Comes with a thick instruction manual or something. I'm sure I'll be reading that one. And there it is. Nice pouch. And there it is. So yeah, quite a nice lens. What else is in here? Oh, just a strap. Okay, well that was the unboxing. Now we're going to do a quick weight comparison of this lens versus the Samyang. Okay, so even just looking at them here, it's pretty easy to tell that the Samyang is actually quite a lot bigger than the Sony. Of course, the Sony is made for the Sony mirrorless full frame cameras, whereas this Samyang is made for the DSLR cameras, and then just has this adapter here attached to it to fit the Sony, so that certainly makes it bigger. So we're going to weigh them now. Now I'll take the lids off, the covers. All right, so we'll start with the Samyang. So that comes in at 583 grams, just over half a kilo. And now the Sony clocks in at 468, and that's of course also uh, with the covers on the back, um, which wouldn't weigh much. So yeah, 468. So um, I guess that means that this Samyang lens is approximately 25% heavier than the Sony, even though the Sony is 1.3 stops brighter, has autofocus motors, a lot of electronics inside. So quite a feat that Sony have managed to get all of that technology into such a little package. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to compare the Samyang against the Sony um, down in the shed with a relatively uniformly lit subject, which is the screen of my projector. It's not completely scientific, obviously, but it worked pretty well. I did the test at noon, roughly, and there were no clouds in the sky at the time, so I think the lighting was quite constant. And I'll be comparing the two lenses against each other, against each of their equivalent f-stop settings, so that you can see for equal settings, how does one lens compare exactly to the other one. And also you'll see also when I go beyond the capability of the Samyang, so that only goes to f2.8. This one goes to f1.8, but I'll also be exposing that lens for the same amount of time and settings that I would use for the f1.8 here, but that one at f2.8. So you can really see the difference in brightness that you get from this lens compared to that one. Okay.
Okay, so here we have the standard f-stop versus f-number graph. You can see on the bottom is the f-number, and that increases in factors of the square root of 2. And on the left side, we have the f-stop, which is linear and increases from 0 to the number at the top, 10. Then next, we have the aperture range of the Samyang lens. So you can see that goes from f2.8 all the way up to f22. Now, I've only shown the increments of one f-stop here, but the actual lens has a few more settings in between those, but these are the only ones that we're going to look at in this video. Next, we have the f-stop range or the aperture range of the Sony lens. So you can see that starts lower at an f-stop of 1.8, and then it goes all the way up to an f-stop of f16. Again, there are more stops on the actual lens in between the dots, but these are the only f-stops that we're going to look at here in increments of one stop, except for, of course, at the beginning, which is 1/3 of a stop from f1.8 to f2. And next we have the graph that shows both the Sony and the Samyang on one graph. So you can see the black ones are basically where both lenses overlap. And then on the beginning and end of that line, we have the areas where the Samyang has a bigger range than the Sony on the closed side of the aperture, and then on the other side we have the Sony has a bigger range than the Samyang on the open side of the aperture because it goes to f1.8. Now the next image shows the crosses where if you actually plotted the true points where you have the f number on that line, then you would see those points at where the crosses are. And you can see wherever there's a whole number value, like F2 and F4 and F8, etc., the crosses are exactly on the dots because that's where the value matches exactly. But in between, where you have kind of the dots at a square root of at an increment of square root of 2, then the cross is not exactly on the dot, because of course at f2.8 is not the exact multiple of square root of 2 times 2, but we will assume for the purpose of this video that the lens manufacturers actually change the apertures in exact one stop increments, and don't actually set the aperture to whatever the f number is incorrectly rounded to. Okay, so now we're going to compare the brightness and color of the two lenses. I'll be showing the Sony lens on the left and the Samyang lens on the right. First here we'll look at the completely unprocessed raw images taken with each of the lenses at f16, which is the smallest common aperture of both lenses. I measured the correct white balance in the room at 5,500 Kelvin, and that's what these images are set to. So first the Sony, and then the Samyang. So I think you can see a couple of things straight away. Obviously, the Samyang has much more severe barrel distortion, while this is almost not noticeable with the Sony. Additionally, it's quite clear that the Samyang has a very strong yellow color cast, while the Sony's color is much more natural. I actually measured this, and the Samyang is about 1050 Kelvin warmer than true white, while the Sony is only about 650 Kelvin off true white. Another noticeable difference is that the field of view of the Samyang is quite a bit wider than that of the Sony. I'm not sure which one is actually closer to 14 millimeters, but it's worth mentioning that the difference in field of view becomes significantly less once the barrel distortion has been corrected, as we'll see later on. Finally, there's also a bit of vignetting in the corners of each lens, and we'll see shortly how this increases as we open the aperture. Okay, so for the purpose of the continued testing, we will remove the color cast of each lens, which will let us focus better on the true difference in brightness of the lenses. So now the images have been adjusted so the white is the same in both images. What I'm going to do now is open the aperture by one stop, but at the same time I'll double the exposure time. So theoretically, the images should look the same, or be at least the same brightness. So here are the same images at f11. Now at f8, f5.6, and now this is where you can start to see a bit of vignetting becoming stronger on the Samyang. F4, the vignetting is getting even a bit stronger. Still not a noticeable difference on the Sony. And F2.8. And now at maximum open, the Samyang is showing really quite strong vignetting. And also the whole image has actually become noticeably darker. So it actually seems like the F2.8 is probably more like F3 or maybe a bit more. Meanwhile, there's also a small increase in vignetting with the Sony. But overall, the Sony is much brighter at f2.8 than the Samyang. Now this next image is the Sony at f2, and the Samyang has been exposed with the same settings as the Sony, but of course it can't go to f2, so it's still at f2.8. You can now definitely see an increase in vignetting with the Sony, and of course the Samyang is much darker because the lens is simply not as bright. And finally, in this next image, the Sony is now at its maximum aperture of f1.8, and the Samyang is also exposed with those settings, but at f2.8. Again, the Sony has increased vignetting, but it's certainly still not really very bad and can easily be compensated for if required. But this image really shows how much brighter the Sony lens is in comparison to the Samyang lens. This next image shows all photos across the entire range for both lenses, with the Sony on top and the Samyang on the bottom. In theory, all images should be equally bright, except for the ones that I've marked with a red box, which is where I extended the lenses beyond their range. So you can see on the bottom left the two images of the Samyang exposed with f2.8, but using exposure times for f2 and f1.8, and also on the top right, the Sony photo exposed at f16, but with the exposure time of the f22 of the Samyang, showing that the Samyang can be stopped down a little more than the Sony. So it's quite clear that although the images should all be equally bright, they are not. Now you might say that the reason for this difference in brightness is due to the vignetting and possibly the field of view, and you'd be right to some extent. So in this next image, you can see what this comparison looks like after both vignetting and barrel distortion have been corrected for in Lightroom. Here you can see again that there really is quite a drop-off in brightness with the Samyang at f2.8, even after compensating for vignetting. The Sony is much more evenly lit across the whole aperture range. Now we'll just quickly take a closer look at the corrected f2.8 comparison of the two lenses. As I mentioned earlier, you can see here that the field of view of the two lenses is much closer after the distortion has been corrected, although the Samyang is still a bit wider than the Sony. So even though both lenses are set to f2.8, the Sony is noticeably brighter than the Samyang.
Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to take a photo of the beautiful mountains back there diagonally with each of the two lenses, and that's basically so that you can compare the edge to edge, corner to corner sharpness of the lenses, and also the field of view and things like that. So yeah, we'll do that next.
So first of all, let's have a look at the whole picture from each lens. I just picked a good f-stop of 5.6 for this comparison, and we'll look at the detail at the different f-stops in a minute. So first, the Sony, and then the Samyang. So when looking at the pictures at a relatively low resolution here in the video, it's difficult to actually spot a real difference. But now, let's take a look at the center of each image at 1:1 resolution. We'll start at f1.8 for the Sony and f2.8 for the Samyang. So you can already see quite easily that with each lens, as wide open as possible, the Sony is more sharp than the Samyang, even in the center of the image. If we now stop down the Sony to the same f-stop as the Samyang, the situation hasn't really changed. The Sony is still super sharp. Now we'll look at both lenses at f4. So that did sharpen up the Samyang a fair bit, but it's still not quite as good as the Sony. Next, at f5.6, the two lenses are now pretty much equally sharp. f8, both lenses still very sharp. f11, still sharp. And now at f16, it looks like both lenses are just a little bit softer, but really still very good. And finally, here are both lenses at their smallest aperture. And here the Samyang really did lose a noticeable amount of sharpness. Now we'll move to the corner of the image, where lens sharpness is, of course, much more challenging than in the center. So beginning again with the Sony at f1.8, maximum aperture, and the Samyang at f2.8, maximum aperture. You can see quite clearly already that the Sony, even at f1.8, is significantly more sharp than the Samyang at f2.8. Now let's go to f2.8, the same as the Samyang. Well, I don't think I need to say much here. The Sony is simply way sharper than the Samyang for the whole aperture range. So I'll just step through them. f4, f5.6, f8, f11, and finally f16. Here the Sony actually loses a bit of sharpness, but it still performs better than the Samyang. The final image is both lenses stopped down to their smallest aperture with the Samyang at f22.
And finally, um, weather permitting, hopefully these clouds will clear tonight. The forecast does seem to indicate that they will. So what we're going to do is try to do some Milky Way shots, which is actually what I bought, these lenses for.
So what I'm going to show you now are two photos of the Milky Way taken directly after each other, with the settings that I would consider to be pretty much ideal for these lenses, both resulting in theoretically equal final brightnesses of images. So on the left is the Sony taken with an aperture of f1.8, 2500 ISO, and 10-second exposure. While on the right is the Samyang taken at f2.8, 3200 ISO, and 20-second exposure. So you can see I used the maximum aperture with both lenses, but had to use a higher ISO and longer exposure time with the Samyang. Now, at a distance, both images look pretty good, and they are. But once again, the difference is in the details, which are quite important when you make large prints for hanging on the wall, etc. So next we're going to look at the center of the Milky Way for each image at 1:1 resolution. As usual, it's quite clear that the Sony is much more sharp, and this is not just due to the better lens sharpness, but also the shorter exposure time resulting in less star trailing. Finally, we'll look at one of the corners, and here the difference in exposure time and sharpness becomes even more obvious. I think the pictures speak for themselves.
Okay, so summary. Um, I think it's pretty clear that this lens is an incredible lens. It's much lighter than the Samyang. It's got autofocus and all the electronics in it. Although I have to say, the autofocus for me isn't actually that important because, for the Milky Way photography that I do, I just usually set that one to infinity, and I was good to go. So that's not really much of an issue. But it does have autofocus, which is a benefit, if you do stuff other than Milky Way. But I think the outstanding factor is, well, there's two things really. The sharpness. I mean, it's just an incredibly sharp, distortion-free lens across the whole field of view, which is amazing. And the other thing, of course, is the brightness of the lens. How they managed to let that much light into this lens. I mean, when you look at the front of it compared to this one, I mean, there's a heap more glass there compared to this one. And yet, somehow, this lens lets in 1.3 stops more light than that one. So Sony's done some sort of amazing optical magic with this lens. And it's a G Master lens. I mean, it really, you know, it is what you expect for a G Master. It's an incredible lens, and I really recommend that you get it if you're interested in you know, very detailed wide angle photography. Having said that, this lens has served me well for the last year and a half roughly. I've taken many beautiful shots with it. You know, it's obviously not as versatile as what I've got now, but if you're just starting out and you want to take your first stab at astrophotography, then it's not a bad lens to start out with, and then you can always progress to this one once you've practiced a bit with that one. And I can tell you that there'll be one for sale very soon on eBay, because I'm going to be selling this one myself. The price tag, by the way, I just had a look. You can buy this lens new. I had a look on DigiDirect. It's $4.99 online, and this one here was $1,830. So this one costs about 3.5 times as much as that lens there. So yeah, I hope that gives you a little bit of information so that you can more easily make the choice which lens to buy for your astrophotography. Thanks. Oh, and by the way, if you like this video, by all means hit the like button, but honestly, you don't need to subscribe to my channel or anything like that. I don't intend to make, you know, a lot of photography videos. It's not really what I do. So I mean, feel free to subscribe if you like, but you know, you probably won't see a lot of camera videos. You'll see some random videos of some guy in Bamboka doing various things. Okay, thanks for watching, and might see you next time. See ya.